KSC presence. This man spent 39 years in jail for a double murder. Then DNA evidence blew up the entire case. Richard Coley spent 39 years in jail following the brutal double murder of his ex-girlfriend Rhonda Wicht and her young son, Donald. But throughout his incarceration, he maintained his innocence and stayed hopeful. Then, after almost 4 decades in jail, DNA evidence caused the case to come crashing down. Coley was born in 1947 to parents Margie and Wilson. His father was a retired Los Angeles cop, and the only child, spent 3 tours of Vietnam in the latter half of the 1960s. However, little did he know that he would unexpectedly wind up on the wrong side of the law in later life. Coley moved to Simi Valley, California, in 1971. And by that time, he had recently married. He later set out on a career as a restaurant manager. Indeed, he held posts at a Rustler's Steakhouse and a Howard Johnson's as the years passed. However, Coley's marriage later broke down. And following his divorce, he started dating a cosmetology student and waitress called Rhonda Wicht, and the two dated for 2 years until 1978. The latter lived in a Simi Valley apartment with her young son Donald. Back in 1978, Simi Valley was a quiet community and considered a safe place to live. That's why the events that unfolded there in November of that year would send shockwaves through the city. That's because on one awful day that month, Wicht and her young son were found dead in their own home. Back in 1978, Simi Valley was a quiet community and considered a safe place to live. That's why the events that unfolded there in November of that year would send shockwaves through the city. That's because on one awful day that month, Wicht and her young son were found dead in their own home. Tragically, both Wicht and her son Donald had been murdered in their beds. The child had been smothered, while his mother had been beaten, raped and strangled with a macrame rope. Furthermore, the apartment had been trashed. Meanwhile, news of the horrific crime traveled quickly through the close-knit community, and eventually word reached Wicht's ex-boyfriend Coley. Indeed, at the time, the pair had only recently broken up. However, the latter had decided to call the police to see if he could find out any more about the crime. While Coley and Wicht had not been a couple at the time of her death, they had kept in contact. In fact, the pair reportedly still kept keys for each other's properties. And they would sometimes help each other out with their respective laundry chores. However, this was not the friendly version of events that police would prescribe to. With that in mind, in the hours that followed the discovery of Wicht and her son, Coley was arrested and subsequently charged with their murders. The cops reportedly said he was an angry ex, who possessed keys to Wicht's apartment, which itself appeared to have not been broken into. Meanwhile, a trial was scheduled for April 1979. However, the jury of 12 could not come to a unanimous decision. So a second trial took place in January 1980, which resulted in Coley being convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Consequently, he received a life sentence with no chance of parole. But while the second jury convicted Coley of Wicht and her son's murders, people who knew the former continued to support him. Indeed, his Simi Valley neighbors signed petitions calling for the verdict to be re-examined. Meanwhile, several newspapers advocated Coley's innocence. Indeed, even the judge who'd presided over his first trial condemned the guilty verdict as a miscarriage of justice. However, it was Coley's parents, Margie and Wilson, who fought the hardest to prove their only child's innocence. They mortgaged their home in Sherman Oaks, California, and used their retirement savings to pay for new investigators and attorneys to work on Coley's case. But all hope was lost when he lost his final appeal, leading to the evidence from his alleged crime being destroyed. However, that wasn't the end of Coley's story. That's because almost a decade after his conviction, Detective Michael Bender from Simi Valley Police Department began to re-examine his case, upon a friend's recommendation. And it was then that Bender discovered a number of issues with it. For one, Coley reportedly had a reliable alibi for all but 20 minutes of the night of the murders. However, It's thought the crimes carried out would have taken a lot longer to commit, according to the Los Angeles Times. Also, fingerprints and hair that was found at the scene wasn't correctly analyzed, it continued. There were also possible suspects other than Coley that were never questioned. So, as Bender analyzed the shortcomings of the case, he found himself suspecting that there had been a miscarriage of justice. He told the Los Angeles Times in 2018, it appeared that a real investigation hadn't occurred. As a result, Bender continued to look into Coley's case. Then, in around 1991, he met the suspect in person at the state prison in Tallahassee where he was being held. And it was during this first encounter with Coley that Bender became convinced that the person he was speaking to was in fact innocent. Bender described his meeting with Coley in an interview with the Los Angeles Times. He said, "In dealing with a lot of bad guys over the years, there are mannerisms and body language you come to know. He didn't have that." And with that in mind, Bender vowed to do everything he could to get Coley's case reopened. As part of his work towards the case, Bender then retrieved 16 boxes of case files from Coley's mother Margie, who had become a widow after the death of her husband in 1988. However, despite his determination, Bender found that there was no desire to reinvestigate the murders, and in 1991 his superiors ordered him to drop the case or lose his job. Meanwhile, the incident left Bender feeling disillusioned with police work. As a result, he quit as a detective and left Simi Valley altogether. However, he kept the 16 boxes of case files and continued to work on proving Coley innocent. Meanwhile, Coley himself tried to remain positive as his years in jail continued to pass. To keep his spirits high, Coley kept in touch with friends and family by sending them letters. He was also in regular contact with Bender, who visited him in prison, sometimes with his daughter Macaulay or with Coley's mom Margie. But despite his links to the outside world, Coley sometimes found life on the inside hard. His stint at the notorious Folsom prison was particularly tough for Coley. But he was the perfect prisoner there, and he helped others through mentoring and by taking part in a veteran support project. He also learned how to make jewelry, and earned money to pay for investigators by selling his wares at the prison gift shop. Meanwhile, Coley's dogged determination to keep going eventually paid off. And in 2015 Bender finally convinced the office of Governor Jerry Brown to look into Coley's case. A year later, in 2016, Bender then conducted a meeting with David Livingstone, Simi Valley's new police chief, who in turn began an investigation alongside the district attorney's office in Ventura County. As a result, DNA evidence relating to Coley's case, which many believed had been destroyed, was uncovered and re-examined. This is how investigators came to find another man's blood, skin cells and sperm on clothing and sheets taken from Wicht's apartment. And while damning, this wasn't the only breakthrough which would eventually exonerate Coley. Witness testimony that had helped to convict Coley was also discredited. When giving evidence in court, a neighbor who lived downstairs from Wicht had claimed to have heard noises coming from the victim's apartment at 5:30 a.m. However, in the hours following the murder, he told police he had heard the disturbance an hour earlier. Meanwhile, on the night of the murders, Coley had reportedly been out with some former colleagues. He had then given one of them a lift at 4:45 a.m. That meant he could not have been responsible for the noises heard by Wicht's downstairs neighbor. Similarly, police detectives alleged that a nearby resident who claimed to have seen Coley's truck driving away from the crime scene could not have possibly been able to identify the driver from their apartment window. With the testimony that had helped to convict Coley disproven and the DNA evidence that seemed to place another man at the scene of the crime, in November 2017 a clemency petition was filed. Governor Brown then pardoned Coley 48 hours later. Consequently, he was finally released from jail on the evening before Thanksgiving, after 39 years of incarceration. Meanwhile, Coley told the Los Angeles Times about the moment he heard he'd finally go free. He said, "You dream about it, you hope for it, but when it happens, it's a shock. to experience it was something I never thought would feel as good. It was joy, just pure joy. I got all tingly in my stomach, and then I was bawling like a baby for a while." Coley hailed Bender as his savior, but the former cop insisted it was his duty to help others. The latter told the Los Angeles Times, "I always believed in truth, integrity and honor. I'm glad this story has a happy ending. If I was on my deathbed knowing he was still in prison, I would have had a hard time with that." But the men's relationship didn't end there. Following Coley's release from jail, he went to stay with Bender and his family at their home in Carlsbad, California. And it was on his way to the latter's residence that he got to sample his initial tastes of freedom, first to an In-N-Out for a burger, then a caramel macchiato at Starbucks. Meanwhile, it had always been Coley's plan to move to Carlsbad if he ever regained his freedom. Indeed, the Bender family had moved Coley's mother, Margie, to the city in 2004 when her health began to decline. Touchingly, Macaulay Bender then cared for her until her death 7 years later. But while Coley was blessed to have a family to lean on, civilian life would not be easy. He was just 31 when he was wrongly convicted, and now faced the prospect of starting his life once more 39 years later. And to top things off, Coley had no driver's license, possessions, photo ID, savings or credit score. Coley then spent his month of freedom too scared to leave his new neighborhood in case he was stopped by cops. However, as his documents began to arrive, he found a new lease of life by taking out his red Jeep for a spin. He also enjoyed chatting to friends on his first ever cell phone, according to the Los Angeles Times. Most of all, Coley enjoyed hanging out with his newfound family, the Benders. And he took particular joy in spending time with their 3-year-old granddaughter, Kara. Her grandmother Cynthia told the Los Angeles Times, "I call Kara my little, and he's my big. In December, I took them both to see Santa." Meanwhile, the California Victim Compensation Board awarded Coley $1.9 million in February 2018, equating to $140 for each day he served in prison. Moreover, it was the highest amount ever handed to an exonerated prisoner in the state of California. But while Coley told the newspaper that the money would help him in his old age, it could never recompense for the time he'd lost. Nor could Coley get much closure on the crime he'd been accused of. This was especially so given that no one else has been arrested in relation to the murders. He told the Los Angeles Times, "It's not something you can describe other than it's painful. I went 4 decades not being able to grieve the woman and child that I loved." Then in February 2019, Simi Valley agreed to another $21 million settlement that Coley would receive on top of the sum awarded by the California Victim Compensation Board. City Manager Eric Levitt explained the importance of the payout in a statement obtained by the Los Angeles Times. He said, "While no amount of money can make up for what happened to Mr. Coley, settling this case is the right thing to do for him and our community." Meanwhile, Coley's attorney Ron Kay told the newspaper that the sum gave his client some vindication. He added that the money would help piece together his life following his near 4-decade incarceration. Kay concluded, "He now can live the rest of his life, which we hope will be really well into the future, with the security he deserves." For his part, Coley used some of the cash to buy a home in Carlsbad, near the Bender family. He also had plans to go traveling, and had booked a trip to Hawaii for his 71st birthday. Aside from that, Coley told the Los Angeles Times that he just wanted to get a dog. He was considering an Australian Shepherd or perhaps a Sheltie, as a companion to stay by his side. But despite the large payout that Coley received, it was the small things that freedom afforded him that he appreciated the most. He added, "What I love is being able to get up in the middle of the night to get a cold drink of water from the refrigerator, or standing out on the porch at night to look up at the stars. These are things I never appreciated so much until now." Thank you for watching. And don't forget to subscribe.